This is my true story. I gave everything to my son, my youth, my money, my health. I thought when I grew old, he would care for me the way I once cared for him. But I was wrong. One evening, weak and hungry, I asked him for food. Instead of kindness, he laughed in my face and mocked me like a stranger. That night, I realized something he didn't know. I held his darkest secret. And what I did with it changed everything. But before I tell you what happened, where are you watching from, and what time is it? And please subscribe. Every father carries dreams for his child, dreams often heavier than his own. I was no different. From the moment my son came into this world, my life stopped being about me and started being about him. I worked days that stretched into nights, weeks that bled into months, never once letting my exhaustion outweigh my responsibility. My back bent under the weight of labor, my hands grew rough with scars, and my stomach often stayed empty. But my son never knew hunger. Every coin I earned seemed to vanish into his needs, but I gave it freely, never questioning if it was too much. For him, nothing was ever too much. I remember the years when he was little, running around barefoot, laughing without a care in the world. His mother was already gone by then, leaving me to raise him alone. I became both mother and father, caretaker and provider, teacher and protector. Every night I cooked, washed, and helped with schoolwork. Every morning I woke early so he would never leave the house without a packed lunch or clean clothes. I thought my sacrifices were seeds, and one day they would grow into gratitude, respect, and love. That belief carried me through the hardest of times. When he entered school, I made sure he always had the best supplies. Other children mocked him once for having old shoes, and I swore it would never happen again. I worked extra hours until I could buy him the nicest pair in the shop. His smile when he wore them was worth more than any money. When he wanted books, I bought them. When he wanted to go on class trips, I picked up extra shifts. And when the bills piled up so high that my own comforts had to disappear, I didn't complain. I told myself, this is what fathers do. We give. As he grew older, his dreams grew bigger, and I tried to match them step for step. When he turned 16, he wanted a car. I couldn't afford it, not really, but I found a way. I sold old tools, pawned family heirlooms, and worked weekends hauling freight for a neighbor. When he drove away in that second-hand car, his laughter echoing in the street, I told myself the debt in my pocket didn't matter. His happiness was my reward. Then came college. Tuition was higher than I had ever imagined, and my heart nearly collapsed when I saw the bills. But again, I found a way. I sold the last pieces of jewelry his mother left behind. I took loans under my name. I pushed my body past its limits, laboring even when my bones begged me to stop. Every dollar I earned, every ounce of energy I spent, I poured into his education. The day he graduated, wearing that cap and gown, I cried quietly in the back of the crowd. Not because I was sad, but because I believed my sacrifices had paid off. I believed I had built him a future. When he married, I stood by his side once more. Weddings are not cheap, but I gave what I could, and more. I helped pay for the reception hall. I paid for part of the honeymoon. I even dipped into my savings, the little money I had put aside for my own old age, because I thought, he deserves a good start. He deserves more than I had. When I handed him the money, he took it with a smile, thanking me briefly before moving on to other things. I brushed it off, telling myself he was simply busy, caught up in the joy of marriage. I told myself the gratitude would come later. In those years, I imagined the rest of my life. I believed my son would always respect me, always make sure I was cared for. I thought I would live my final years in dignity, sitting in the corner of his home, watching my grandchildren grow, listening to laughter echo through the rooms. I imagined him checking on me, bringing me tea, making sure I never felt alone. That was the future I thought I had earned. That was the future I believed my sacrifices had built. But dreams, I learned, can turn into illusions, and sacrifices, when placed in the wrong hands, can be forgotten. What I thought would be the foundation of love and respect became invisible to him. The years of hunger I endured so he could eat. The nights I stayed awake so he could sleep. The life I gave so he could live. He did not see them as proof of love. He saw them as nothing. And one day, all those sacrifices came crashing back into my face, not as gratitude, but as humiliation. When I first moved into my son's house, I thought it would be temporary, a simple arrangement until I got stronger, until my health improved, until I found my own way again. He invited me at first with a smile, telling me I should relax now after all the years of work. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the boy I had raised would now take care of me, as I once took care of him. For the first few weeks, things seemed fine. I stayed mostly in my room, quiet, never asking for much. I ate when food was given. I sat quietly in the living room when space allowed, and I tried not to disturb their life. I thought if I stayed small, if I stayed invisible, he wouldn't feel burdened by me. But slowly, I began to notice a change in his tone, in his eyes, in the way he spoke to me. The warmth was gone. The kindness I once believed was natural had faded into coldness. It began with small things: sighs when I asked for my medicine, a shake of the head when I asked if he could drive me to the doctor, irritation in his voice when I forgot to turn off a light or left my shoes by the door. At first, I told myself it was stress. Maybe he was tired from work. Maybe he was adjusting to having me around. I excused him again and again because I didn't want to see the truth. But then the comments began. Why can't you just manage by yourself? Do you really need that? You should be grateful I even let you stay here. Those words pierced me like thorns. Each sentence reminded me I was no longer a father in his eyes. I was a nuisance. I was weight. I was a mouth to feed, not a man to respect. I kept silent, swallowing the hurt, telling myself it was better to bear the pain quietly than to cause conflict. The humiliation grew heavier each day. I remember sitting at the table one morning, pouring myself a small cup of tea. He came into the kitchen, looked at me, and said, "Don't take too much. That's for everyone, not just you." My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the cup. I wasn't a guest in his home anymore. I was a beggar taking crumbs. His wife, my daughter-in-law, sometimes looked at me with pity, but she never spoke against him. She lived caught between loyalty to her husband and silent compassion for me. But pity is not love, and silence is not defense. There were nights when I sat in my room listening to laughter downstairs, hearing them eat together while no one called me to join. I stayed in the dark, hungry, but too ashamed to ask. I remembered the times when he was a child, and I never once ate before he did. I remembered spooning the last bite of food onto his plate while I lied and said I was full. And now, the same boy who once depended on me for every meal treated me like an intruder in his kitchen. I began to see it clearly. In his house, I wasn't a father anymore. I wasn't even family. I was a burden, a shadow he tolerated until he could no longer hide his disdain. I walked carefully, spoke softly, tried to make myself smaller, but nothing I did seemed to change his eyes. They no longer carried love. They carried resentment. It is one thing to grow old. It is another thing to grow old in silence, in rejection, in humiliation. And I felt it every day. The home I thought would be a shelter became a cage. The son I thought would be my comfort became my captor. And the respect I thought I had earned with a lifetime of sacrifice became nothing more than dust at his feet. That was when I realized the truth. I was not living with my son. I was surviving under him. It was a cold evening, the kind where the walls themselves seemed to shiver. I had eaten nothing since the morning, just a small piece of bread I found left on the counter. My stomach twisted and growled, but more than hunger, it was the weight of shame pressing on me. I had grown weaker with age, and sometimes even walking to the kitchen felt like a burden. That night, I heard the sound of plates clattering, forks scraping against dishes, and laughter echoing from the dining room. The smell of hot food drifted down the hallway, roasted meat, bread, and something sweet. My mouth watered, but my heart sank, because I knew they had not called me to join. Again, I sat quietly on the edge of my bed, waiting for the noise to stop, hoping maybe a plate would be brought to me afterward. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. The laughter grew louder, their joy piercing the silence of my empty room. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my stomach, trying to silence the hunger. But when the sounds of their meal finally faded, and I heard chairs scraping as they rose from the table, I knew there would be no plate, no leftovers brought to me this time. The ache in my belly was unbearable. I swallowed my pride and decided to ask. I walked slowly into the living room, where my son sat on the couch, scrolling on his phone. His wife was clearing dishes in the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, my voice caught in my throat, before I finally managed to whisper, "Son, could I have something to eat? Just a little." My words were soft, trembling, heavy with embarrassment. I wasn't asking for a feast, just for kindness. He looked up at me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of surprise. But then his lips curled into a smirk. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and said words that cut deeper than any blade. "Beg louder, old man. Maybe then you'll get something." I froze. My ears rang as if the whole room had collapsed. Did I hear him right? My son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy I once fed while I went hungry, was now mocking me like I was some stray dog. His laugh followed, sharp and cruel, bouncing around the room like an echo I couldn't escape. His wife stood silently in the kitchen, her hands frozen over the dishes, but she said nothing. No defense, no protest, just silence. Tears filled my eyes, hot and shameful. I tried to speak, but my throat closed. My lips quivered as I whispered, "I'm not begging, I'm just asking." But he only shook his head, still smirking, before returning to his phone as if I didn't exist. To him, my hunger was a joke, my dignity something to trample on. I stood there for a long moment, the silence suffocating. My legs trembled, not just from weakness, but from humiliation. I finally turned and walked back to my room, each step heavier than the last. My hands wiped at my face, but the tears wouldn't stop. By the time I reached my bed, I collapsed onto it, curling into myself like a child. The hunger remained, gnawing at my stomach, but worse than hunger was the pain in my chest. I remembered every meal I had skipped for him. I remembered boiling rice while pretending I wasn't hungry, handing him the larger portion while I ate scraps. I remembered giving him the last piece of bread, telling him I was full when my stomach was empty. I remembered watching him eat with joy, thinking to myself that this was what love meant, sacrifice. And now, the same boy I had fed with my hands laughed at me when I asked for food. I wept quietly into the pillow, not just for the food I didn't receive, but for the respect I had lost. It wasn't hunger that broke me, it was humiliation. It was the realization that in his eyes, I was no longer a father, no longer a man, but a joke. That night, as the house grew quiet and I lay in the darkness with tears staining my pillow, something inside me hardened. I thought about the secret I had carried for years, the truth my son thought no one knew. Until now, I had kept it buried, locked away, believing that silence was love, that protecting him was my duty. But as I lay there, starving in both body and dignity, I realized that my silence had become my own prison. And perhaps, just perhaps, the truth was the only key I had left. That night, I lay on my bed in the dark, my stomach empty, but my heart far emptier. Hunger is painful, yes, but humiliation is far worse. Hunger fades with time, but humiliation echoes in the soul, reminding you of your worthlessness. I pulled the blanket over my body, though the cold came not from the air, but from inside me. My son's laugh still rang in my ears, sharp and cruel, cutting deeper each time I replayed it. "Beg louder, old man." Those words clung to me like poison, replaying over and over until I could barely breathe. As I closed my eyes, memories rushed forward, uninvited. I remembered the nights when he was just a child, sick with fever, shivering in bed. I would stay awake all night, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering that he would be all right. I remembered the mornings when there was not enough food for both of us, and I quietly pretended I was full while sliding the larger portion onto his plate. I remembered working double shifts, sweat soaking through my shirt, my muscles aching, just so he could have a new pair of shoes for school and not feel ashamed among his friends. I remembered pawning my wedding ring, the last thing I had of his mother, to pay for his college application fees. Every sacrifice I had made replayed in my mind, and with each memory, the sting of his laughter grew sharper. Tears slid down my face silently, soaking into the pillow. But they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of realization. Realization that everything I had given him, the food, the education, the comfort, the love, had not built gratitude. It had built arrogance. My son was not the man I thought he was. He was not the child I had raised with love. He was someone else now, someone cold, someone cruel. And I had allowed it by being silent for too long. Yet as I lay there, broken and hungry, another thought crept into my mind, a thought that carried both pain and power. My son thought he held all the control, that his house, his money, his arrogance gave him power over me. But he was wrong. He had forgotten one thing. I knew something he didn't think I knew. I knew his secret. For months, maybe even years, I had been aware of his betrayal. Not betrayal against me, but against his wife, the woman who shared his home, who cooked his meals, who raised his children. I had stumbled upon it accidentally, late one night, when he left his phone unattended. Messages, photos, receipts, the evidence was all there. At first, I felt crushed. How could he dishonor his marriage so carelessly? How could the boy I raised to be honest and loyal live such a double life? But instead of exposing him, I stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that maybe he would change, that maybe he would stop before anyone got hurt. I carried his secret the way I carried all my burdens, quietly. But now, after what he had done to me, silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like betrayal. Betrayal against myself, betrayal against truth, and betrayal against the woman he was deceiving every single day. My silence had shielded him, but in doing so, it had stripped me of my dignity. That night, as I stared into the darkness, I realized something important. The secret I carried was no longer a burden. It was a weapon. My son thought he could laugh at me, mock me, starve me of respect. But he had forgotten that even the weakest old man can still carry the power of truth. I wiped my tears, my hunger still gnawing, but my heart growing harder. He had starved me of food, but I would starve him of lies. He had humiliated me in front of himself and his wife, but I would humiliate him in front of the truth. I rolled onto my side and whispered to myself in the dark, no more silence, no more weakness. The pain in my chest remained. But beneath it grew something else. Resolve. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had something he could not take from me, something he could not laugh away. That night, I went to bed hungry, but I also went to bed holding a new kind of power, and though my body trembled from weakness, my heart began to steady itself. My son thought he had erased me with cruelty. He didn't know I carried the one truth that could erase the mask he wore every day. Every man hides something, but some truths are heavier than others. My son believed his secret was safe, hidden behind locked screens, late nights, and carefully chosen words. But he underestimated the eyes of a father who sees more than he lets on. I discovered his betrayal by accident, though once I saw it, I could never unsee it. It was late one evening when I went to the kitchen for water. His phone buzzed on the table, screen lighting up with a message. I never meant to pry, but when you live in a house where your presence is treated like an inconvenience, your instincts sharpen. The name on the screen wasn't his wife's. Curiosity made me glance closer, and there it was, a message too intimate, too personal to belong to a married man. My chest grew tight, my throat dry. I wanted to look away, but my hands betrayed me, and before I knew it, I had unlocked the phone. What I found wasn't just a single message. It was dozens of them. Long threads of late-night confessions, flirtations, photos exchanged in secrecy. Pictures of him with another woman, smiling in ways I hadn't seen him smile with his wife in years. Screenshots of hotel bookings, receipts tucked in his email, nights that didn't match the stories he told at home. Every tap of my finger revealed more proof that the life he lived in daylight was a mask, and beneath it was deception. I remember sitting there in silence, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. I thought of his wife, the young woman who treated me kindly even when my son mocked me. I thought of the children, innocent and unaware, growing up in a house that was built on betrayal. My hands shook as I put the phone down. I felt sick, not just because of what I saw, but because of who he had become. At first, I chose silence. I told myself it was not my place to interfere. I told myself maybe it was temporary. Maybe he would come to his senses and stop before his marriage collapsed. I carried the truth in my chest like a burning coal, heavy and suffocating. Each time I saw his wife smile, each time I saw the children laugh, the coal grew hotter. I wanted to tell her, but I convinced myself that protecting her from pain was kinder than exposing her to betrayal. So I buried it, the way I had buried so many of my own wounds. But now, after what he had done to me, laughing when I begged for food, mocking me in front of his wife, silence no longer felt like love. It felt like chains. Every time I thought of his smirk, of his words, "Beg louder, old man," I realized I had protected him while he destroyed me. I had shielded him from the consequences of his actions, while he starved me of respect, starved me of dignity. The truth became my weapon. Not a weapon of hate, but a weapon of balance. If he could humiliate me with laughter, then I could humiliate him with reality. If he could strip me of dignity, then I could strip him of lies. My silence had allowed him to walk tall while I crawled low, but the evidence I held, screenshots, receipts, photographs, would force him to his knees. For years, I thought the duty of a father was to protect his child at all costs, even from the truth. But that night, I realized another truth. A father's duty is not to protect his child's lies. It is to protect justice, dignity, and truth itself. And if that meant my son's marriage collapsed, if that meant his pride shattered, then so be it. I sat alone in my room, staring at the ceiling, the weight of years pressing down on me. In the silence, I whispered to myself, "No more. No more silence. No more humiliation. No more pretending that my son was a man he was not. He had laughed when I was hungry, but soon no one would laugh with him again." The night after his laughter echoed in my ears, I sat alone in my small room, staring at the wooden box where I had hidden the evidence. For months, maybe even years, it had sat untouched, buried under old clothes, tucked away like a shadow I pretended wasn't there. Every time I thought about opening it, my heart would ache, and I would push it aside. But that night was different. My son's mocking voice still rang in my head. "Beg louder, old man." Those words burned through me more fiercely than hunger ever could. My stomach growled with emptiness, but my soul was full of fire. I knew then that my silence had lasted too long. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached for the box. My fingers brushed against the old wood, rough and familiar. For years, it had been a coffin for secrets, his secrets, and I had been its keeper. I opened it, and inside were the folders I had once gathered quietly, almost against my will. Printouts of messages I had saved, photographs copied and hidden away, receipts I had found in the trash but never forgotten. Proof upon proof of the double life he lived. Proof that my son was not the man his wife believed he was. I laid everything out on the table, piece by piece. The weight of the papers felt heavier than steel. Each page carried not just evidence, but betrayal. As I looked at them, I asked myself if I was truly ready to use them. A father exposing his own son. What kind of man does that make me? But then I remembered standing in the living room, weak and hungry, begging for food while he laughed at me. I remembered every meal I had skipped for him as a child, every sacrifice I had made, every tear I had hidden. And in that moment, I understood. He had already destroyed the bond between us. What remained was not father and son. What remained was truth and lies. The decision was no longer a question. It was necessity. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, slid them into a plain envelope, and sealed it shut. My hands shook as I pressed the flap closed, but my heart steadied with each second. For too long, he had starved me of dignity. For too long, I had carried his sins so he could live in comfort. That envelope was not just evidence. It was my justice. I thought about who should see it. My son didn't deserve my words anymore. He would laugh, deny, twist the truth as he always had. No, the person who deserved to see it was the woman he betrayed. His wife, my daughter-in-law. She had shown me more kindness than he ever did. She wasn't perfect, but she treated me with some measure of respect, even when silence kept her from defending me. She had been living blind, trusting a man who smiled at her by day and betrayed her by night. She deserved to know. She deserved the truth. I imagined the moment I would hand it to her. I wouldn't need many words. I wouldn't need anger or long speeches. The truth would speak for itself. My son thought he held all the power in the house, that his money, his arrogance, his mocking laughter gave him control over me. But tomorrow he would learn that even an old man, weak and hungry, could hold the one thing stronger than wealth: proof. I placed the envelope on the table beside me that night and sat staring at it for hours. My stomach still ached, but for the first time in a long time, my hunger didn't matter. I felt something stronger than pain. I felt resolve. I whispered into the silence of my room, "You starved me of respect. Tomorrow, I starve you of lies." The morning light crept through the curtains as I sat with the envelope on my lap. I hadn't slept a single hour. My body was tired, my bones ached, and the hollowness of hunger still lingered in my stomach. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Today was the day I would end my silence. Today was the day I would let the truth speak. I heard her in the kitchen, my daughter-in-law. She was humming softly as she prepared breakfast for the children. Her voice, though faint, carried a gentleness my son had long since forgotten. For years, I had watched her work tirelessly, juggling a home, children, and a husband who treated her love like a convenience rather than a gift. She had no idea she was sharing her life with a man who betrayed her trust every time he stepped out at night. She deserved better than lies. She deserved better than him. I rose slowly from my chair, my knees stiff, my back hunched, and clutched the envelope tightly. Each step down the hall felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of years, of silence, of betrayal pressed down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with a strange calm, the kind that comes when you know there is no turning back. She turned as I entered the kitchen, her eyes widening slightly. "Oh, good morning, Dad," she said politely, wiping her hands on a towel. "Did you sleep well?" I didn't answer her question. My throat was dry, my voice heavy with everything I carried. Instead, I extended the envelope toward her with trembling hands. For a moment she looked confused, glancing from me to the plain, sealed paper. "What's this?" she asked softly, her brow furrowing. I took a deep breath, my words quiet but sharp, each one carved from years of pain. "You should know the truth about the man you married." Her hands froze as she took the envelope. The kitchen, once filled with the soft hum of morning life, now fell silent. The children's laughter in the other room seemed distant, muffled, as if the world itself had paused to witness this moment. Her fingers shook as she held the envelope, sensing its weight before even opening it. I didn't wait for her to speak. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. There was nothing more to say. The truth didn't need my voice. It was already there, inside the paper, in the photographs, the messages, the receipts, undeniable, unshakable proof of betrayal. As she stood there, staring at the envelope, I turned and walked away. My footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, steady, deliberate. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt seen, not by her eyes, but by the truth itself. Behind me, I heard her breath hitch, a soft gasp breaking the silence. She had opened the envelope. Papers shuffled in her trembling hands. The sound of proof unraveling illusions filled the air, the sound of a life about to break apart. Her voice cracked as she whispered, almost to herself, "No, no, this can't be." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see her face to know the storm had begun. The betrayal I had carried quietly for years was now hers to see, hers to feel. And my son, the man who once mocked me as I begged for food, would soon face the wrath of truth from the one person he had deceived most. As I reached the door to my room, I paused for a moment, resting my hand on the frame. I whispered, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but enough for myself. It's done. The silence is over. For years, I had lived with humiliation. For years, I had carried his secret, starving myself of justice. But in that moment, I realized something powerful. Truth, once revealed, cannot be buried again. It lives, it spreads, and it destroys lies in its path. That morning, as my daughter-in-law held the envelope with trembling hands, her world collapsed. And in that collapse, I finally began to rebuild my own. That evening, the house was no longer quiet. It shook with voices, voices so loud they seemed to rattle the windows. I sat in my room, the door closed, but I could hear everything. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and broken, filled with both fury and grief, cut through the walls. She wasn't the soft-spoken woman I had heard humming in the kitchen that morning. She was a storm, unleashing years of trust that had just turned into ash. "Who is she?" I heard her scream. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the photos. I've read the messages." Her words trembled, but they were strong. This was not a question. This was an accusation. Then came my son's voice, defensive, angry, arrogant as always. "You don't understand. It's nothing. She means nothing." He tried to shout over her, to silence her with volume, the same way he had tried to silence me with mockery. But this time, his voice didn't carry power. It carried desperation. The clash went back and forth, her sobs, her fury, her demands for answers, his denials, his half-hearted excuses, his attempts to twist the truth. But lies fall apart when faced with proof. I had given her more than suspicion. I had given her evidence that no argument could erase. Every receipt, every photo, every late-night record spoke louder than his protests. The more he shouted, the more hollow his words sounded. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands folded, listening. Part of me felt sorrow for the destruction happening just down the hall. A family was unraveling, a marriage shattering into pieces. Children would soon hear things no child should ever hear. But another part of me, the part that had been mocked, humiliated, and starved of dignity, felt something else. Justice. My son had built his pride on lies, and now those lies were burning around him. At one point, I heard her cry out through her sobs. "All this time, while I cooked for you, while I raised our children, while I trusted you, this is what you were doing?" Her voice cracked in a way that made my chest tighten. She had been loyal, faithful, blind to his betrayal, and now the truth stabbed her deeper than any blade. The shouting grew so loud I thought the neighbors might hear. But I didn't move. I stayed in my room, silent, still, calm. I wasn't part of the storm anymore. I was its cause, yes, but I was not its victim. This was his storm to face, his lies to drown in. Finally, the shouting turned into silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence heavy with exhaustion. Doors slammed. Footsteps echoed. Then came a sound I had never heard before. My son's voice, cracking, desperate, begging. He had mocked me when I begged for food. Now, he was the one begging for forgiveness, begging to hold together the life he had taken for granted. But I knew it was too late. The truth doesn't bargain. The truth doesn't forgive. The truth only reveals. and once it is revealed, it cannot be unseen. I leaned back on my bed, staring at the ceiling, and let out a long breath. The house that once echoed with his arrogance was now filled with his downfall. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel weak. I didn't feel invisible. I felt steady, as if the years of humiliation were finally balanced by this single night of justice. The shouting in the house had died down into silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield after the smoke clears, broken, tense, and heavy with things that could never be repaired. I thought perhaps the night would pass without him coming to me, that maybe he would sit with his wife and try to stitch together the pieces of his shattered marriage. But I was wrong. His footsteps stormed down the hallway like thunder, heavy, fast, and full of rage. My door flew open, slamming against the wall, and there he stood, his face red, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "You!" he spat, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You ruined everything! You think you're clever? You think exposing me makes you strong? You're nothing, old man, nothing!" His voice cracked with fury, but beneath the anger, I heard something else. Fear. The kind of fear only truth can bring. I didn't rise from my chair. I didn't flinch. I sat still, my hands resting calmly on my knees, my gaze steady. For years, I had been the one trembling while he shouted, the one shrinking smaller while he grew louder, but not this time. This time, the power wasn't in his volume. It was in my silence. He stepped closer, towering over me, his face twisted. "How dare you? How dare you interfere in my marriage? Do you realize what you've done? She'll leave me. The kids, she'll take them away. You've destroyed my life." I let his words crash over me like waves, but they didn't drown me. They only confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't angry because I betrayed him. He was angry because I exposed him. He wasn't weeping for the pain he caused his wife. He was weeping for himself, for his pride, for his image. When he finally paused, breathing hard, waiting for me to defend myself, I lifted my eyes and spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and sharper than any shout. "You laughed when I begged for food," I said slowly. "Now no one will laugh with you again." The words cut through him deeper than any scream could. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His fury froze, his shoulders stiffened, and his face turned pale. For the first time in years, he was speechless. He had mocked me, humiliated me, reduced me to tears. But now, in one sentence, I had stripped him bare. We stared at each other in silence. His fists clenched, his breathing ragged, but he couldn't find words, because the truth had left him defenseless. His arrogance, his laughter, his control, all gone. What remained was a man exposed, a son who had forgotten respect, now facing the father he thought was powerless. Finally, he turned away, slamming the door behind him, his footsteps retreating down the hall. I sat alone in the quiet once more, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It wasn't the silence of humiliation, it was the silence of justice. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and felt a weight lift from my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one left begging. The days that followed were unlike any I had seen in that house. The shouting stopped, replaced by silence, but it was not the same silence that once weighed on me like a chain. This silence belonged to my son. His arrogance was gone, his voice quieter, his steps slower. He avoided me, avoided his wife, avoided even his children, as if shrinking under the truth that had finally cornered him. I watched him move through the house like a ghost, and for the first time, it wasn't me who felt invisible. It was him. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, was different. Her eyes carried pain, yes, but also clarity. The woman who once smiled through her days, unaware of her husband's lies, now walked with a burden of knowledge, but also with strength. She began spending more time with the children, keeping them close to her, shielding them from his moods. She didn't cry where they could see, but I heard her at night, soft sobs muffled by the walls. And though it pained me to know she suffered, I also knew it was better than living blind. She had the truth now, and truth, though painful, frees the soul. One evening, a few days later, she knocked on my door. I looked up, expecting anger or blame, but instead, her eyes were full of tears. She stepped inside quietly, sat down beside me, and took my hand in hers. Her voice trembled as she said, "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for not letting me live in lies." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, my eyes blurred. No one had thanked me in years. No one had looked at me with gratitude instead of pity or annoyance. Her words, simple and trembling, fed me more than any meal could have. I squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "You deserved the truth. You always did." Not long after, she made her decision. She left him. She packed her things, gathered the children, and walked out of the house with her head held high. I watched her from the window as she held her little ones close, her steps steady, her resolve unshakable. My son shouted after her, pleaded with her, but his words fell into the air like stones into a well, heavy, empty, forgotten. She didn't look back. And when the door finally closed behind her, my son stood in the empty hall, broken, defeated, his lies stripped away. He turned to me once, his face pale, his eyes full of blame, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew. He knew his downfall began the moment he laughed at me, the moment he starved me of respect. He had mocked me when I begged for food. But now it was he who was left with nothing to eat. No love, no trust, no family. I sat in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, and for the first time in many years, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. Dignity. Not because I destroyed him, but because I stood for myself. For too long, I had been silent, swallowing humiliation like bitter medicine. But in the end, I chose truth over silence. And truth gave me back what humiliation had stolen. He starved me of respect, I starved him of lies, and in the end, the truth fed me more than food ever could.